For our devotional, we'll be in Colossians 3:11 through 14. I'll be using the New Living Translation. Paul begins this section by highlighting the circumstances surrounding the new life that has been granted to these Christians in Colossae. Starting in verse 11, he says, "In this new life, it doesn't matter if you are a Jew or a Gentile, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbaric, uncivilized, slaves, or free. Christ is all that matters, and he lives in all of us." Following on the heels of what Aiden and Walker talked to us about over the last few days, Paul is addressing the new life in Christ that these Christians inherited when they came out of the waters of baptism. But I want you to notice that Paul is saying it makes no difference whether these Colossian Christians are Jews, Gentiles, free men, or even slaves. He says that the only thing that matters is Christ himself, and that he is the one who is living in us, making us alive through him into one body. If we take a look at the scriptures or even historical sources, it's clear that the Jews despise the Gentiles. They despise them so much, and they also despise the poor and the outcasts of society. There was massive amounts of infighting so often in the early church that even the biblical writers had to address it on many occasions. Knowing these things, Paul tells them that these Christians, Paul tells these Christians that whatever cultural or doctrinal division that was breaking out in Colossae was to have no part in their lives. He is affirming each and every one of them, saying that they are all equally important in Christ's kingdom, despite their backgrounds. And really, this is what the church is supposed to look like, just the way that Jesus established it. And like these first century Christians, we too come from many different places with many different cultural backgrounds, customs, hobbies, and interests, and yet we can all come here together in unity and have fellowship because of the one who died for us on the cross. It's interesting to me that even though the world is oftentimes looking to be accepted and affirmed, they pass right by Jesus in the church. Oftentimes I'll hear, "Oh, those Christians over there, they can't even figure it out amongst themselves. Why would I want to be a part of that?" An apologist named Frank Turek said it best when being called a hypocrite. He said, "Hey, pal, come on down. We got room for one more." Well, in all seriousness, I know that I and many others have been deeply flawed in this department. We make mistakes and false judgments based on the way that others look, act, and speak, just like these first century Christians had done. And well, Paul is going to continue in the next two verses by telling them how to treat each other as their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Continuing in verse 12, he says, "So since God has chosen you to be the holy people that he loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, making allowances for each other's faults and forgiving anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others." Paul is calling them to unity, into one body, to live out their God-given obligations as the family of Christ. You would think that what Paul is saying in verses 12 through 13 are a no-brainer, yet we see that almost every church in the New Testament has a laundry list of sins that have to constantly be addressed. And just like today, so many of us struggle to meet the level of decency and holiness that Paul has instructed them to keep. You see, Paul is not giving his brothers and sisters any wiggle room on the things he's commanding them. He says in verse 12, "Since God specifically chose us to be holy and beloved, we must clothe ourselves with these things: mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, making allowance for one another's faults." When was the last time we made room for people's mistakes? I know I'm guilty of that one. He also says, "Remember that because the Lord forgave you, you must also forgive others." I remember a coworker that I worked with back in Washington a few years ago that, man, he would just say so many horrible and mean things to me. He would lie to me. He would steal from me. He would literally plot against me to try to get me to lose my job. And unfortunately, I did the same things back to him. And after a few years rather, just the first year of being a Christian, I called him. And I said, hey, I am so sorry for the things that I said to you, the things I did to you, and the things that I wished had happened to you. And after a brief conversation, we were able to make peace. And wow, what a weight lifted off my shoulders. But how can we go from hating somebody 1 minute and wishing all the harm in the world upon them and loving them unconditionally the next? Paul is saying that Christ is the solution. He says that following the ways of Christ is how we do that, and to be the example for our lives and how we should live. Paul finishes out in verse 14 by going back to his clothing analogy. He says, above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds us all together in perfect harmony. Do you remember what Jesus said about what sums up the entirety of the law and the prophets? He said to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Paul says here that love is the thing that binds us all together in a state of perfect harmony. Think about how great this world would be if we showed each other the love that's contained in this verse, the love that Christ expects from his people. Think about how much sweeter the church would be if we loved each other like that all the time. I'm not going to pretend like this is easy. As someone who has lots of experience living in the world and abiding by its rules, it's not easy to choose Christ every day. I know that many of you full well know what I'm getting at. That whole thing about crucifying your flesh and taking up your cross every single day is the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. And I imagine that many of you would agree with me, at least in some part. So how do we go about doing that practically? This week, I'm going to make it my goal to pick two things specifically from this passage to focus on living out a Christ-like example. And I would encourage you to focus on a few of these things yourselves, ones that you know that you can work on and actively try to hold yourself accountable for. So, when a brother does something against you, forgive him. And when a sister makes a mistake, give her room to grow. We're all in this race together. We're all striving for the same goal at the end of the day. And Paul said, let's be humble. Show each other mercy with kindness, gentleness, and patience. Now I want to close this devotional time. I went way faster than I thought I was going to. I want to close this devotional time by saying that Sunset has been a blessing for Mattia and I. And I want all of you to know that you've made small and large impacts, at least in some way and in a lot of ways. And we're truly blessed by you. And I don't want you to walk away from this devotional message thinking that you're not doing good enough, because you are, and it shows. And I want to thank you for striving to live out a Christ-like example and applying these words to your life. And just as I'm trying to be more like Christ, I want to encourage you to keep going, to keep loving, and to keep clothing yourselves with Christ as we are all bound together in unity.